"You're going to be with us," said the three giant women, already living on the farm he bought Wild West Stories. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. A man rides west with nothing left but a deed and the hope of a fire to call his own. Yet the house is not empty. Three women wait on the porch, silent as stone. What follows is no tale of gun smoke, but of scars, storms, and the quiet mercy of choosing to stay. A weary rider comes west with nothing left but a deed and a fading hope of warmth. Boone Whitmore rode alone, his shadow long against the red dirt road that stretched like a tired rope across the land. The saddle creaked with each sway of the bay's gait, leather dry as old hands. The afternoon sun burned low, laying a brass sheen over the scrub and stones, while a pair of crows carved circles in the wide, empty sky. Their calls faded quick in that kind of silence only the frontier knew, so wide it swallowed sound whole. He carried little more than a knife worn dull at the tip, a coil of rope, a pouch of coffee, and a folded deed marked with the faded seal of the territorial office. It wasn't worth much in weight, but it was the one thing that kept his hope from blowing away. Boone no longer chased after grand notions. He only wanted a place where fire glowed steady in the grate at night, a chair that wouldn't splinter under him, and the sound of another person moving somewhere in the house. 3 days on the trail had stripped both man and horse to quiet endurance. Boone rationed his water, ate without hurry, took only what was needed to see another mile. Toward evening of the third day, the wind shifted, carrying the dry scent of charred grass mixed with a hidden damp far below the soil. He tugged the reins, listening. It was a sign of water, maybe pasture, the kind of thing a man clings to when he's put all he owns into one piece of paper. That night, he pitched his canvas low against the wind, found enough dead mesquite to spark a small fire. He set a tin pot over the coals, let the coffee boil until the rim foamed, then pulled it aside to settle. The chipped enamel cup burned his fingers as he drank, the rough edge catching his lip, a reminder that nothing stays whole forever. But broken things still serve if you handle them right. The night was so still he could hear the horse breathing. Boone lay under his blanket, eyes on the coals pulsing down to ash. Out of the quiet, he thought he caught the memory of floorboards creaking, the smell of cornbread rising. He didn't reach for it. Best not to name such things. Memories fade easier when you let them sit like a companion who comes and goes without talk. At dawn, the cold bit deep. He kicked dust over the fire, leaving a clean ring of ash. Old habit. A small circle gave a man the notion he'd claimed his ground, even if just for one night. The bay nudged the reins into his palm, ready to move. They rode through a shallow draw where the grass grew greener, proof of a hidden spring. Beyond it, the land eased into a slope, and at the crest, Boone reined up. Below lay the farm, a scatter of fence lines leaning like tired men, a house of weathered boards tilted a little left, the roof line scarred but still holding. No smoke rose from the chimney. The yard carried only faint hoof marks, long since dry. It looked like a place left waiting. A heartbeat paused. Boone pulled out the deed, smoothing it across his thigh. The ink had bled faint with time, but the seal still marked it official. He slid it back into his coat and tightened his grip. It wasn't proof for anyone else. It was a promise to himself. This time, he meant to stay. He let the horse pick its way down, slow, iron shoes ticking against stone. The scent of old timber and hay drifted closer. Passing a broken stretch of fence, he paused, set one soundpost back into place. Not because it mattered, but because work with the hands teaches a man to believe again. At the edge of the yard he stopped, hat brim low against the morning glare. The house sat with its porch shadow stretching long across the dirt, boards scarred with knife marks of long-ago carpenters. The air held that peculiar hush just before a thing reveals itself. Boone stepped down, boots sinking in the dust. He looped the reins over the hitch rail and stood still, listening. Nothing but wind through dry grass, the kind of quiet that makes a man feel both safe and uneasy. He ran a hand back through his hair, straightened his collar. The porch waited, bathed half in light, half in shade. Something in that stillness pressed on his chest, neither fear nor welcome, but the sense that the next step would carry him into a life not yet written. He let the silence breathe, then moved forward, slow. Out here, a man learns not to rush. Sometimes the truest words are the ones left unspoken, carried by the dust and the wind. But the house he bought is not empty. 3 silent women already stand on its porch. The sun had just lifted high enough to cast the yard in sharp light when Boone stepped off the rise and crossed the last stretch of open ground. The house stood ahead, rough-hewn and plain, boards grayed by years of weather, its roof patched in more than one place. It looked lived in, but still he expected silence, the kind that settles over abandoned places. Yet, as he neared the porch, his boot sinking softly in the dry dust, movement caught the corner of his eye. 3 figures stood where the shadow of the eaves met the morning light. They hadn't been there a moment ago, or maybe they had. Standing so still, they'd become part of the house itself. They were women, tall in a way that made the porch boards creak beneath them. Not polished or delicate, but built from the same timber and work as the land around them. The tallest, with shoulders straight as fence posts, stood a step ahead of the others. Her arms rested easy at her sides, yet something in her stance reminded Boone of a draft horse steadying against its harness. The other 2 flanked her, one broad in the hips, her dark hair braided tight, the other younger, freckles scattered across a face sunburnt from open fields. They did not move to greet him, nor did they shrink back. Their eyes followed his every step, watchful, unblinking, as though measuring the weight of his presence against the land itself. Boone slowed, one hand brushing the dust from his coat. He felt the stillness in his chest, the same way a man feels the air shift before thunder. The deed in his pocket suddenly felt small, like paper in a world that only recognized sweat and scars. For a breath, no one spoke. The yard was quiet, save for the horse flicking its tail against flies and the soft clink of its bit. Then, in a voice steady and low, the tall woman spoke. "You're going to be with us." The words weren't a threat nor a welcome. They were delivered plain, as if naming the weather or the shape of the land. But they carried a weight that sank deep into Boone's chest, pressing harder than the long miles behind him. He stood there, caught between the wind and their gaze. Dust swirled across the yard, curling around his boots. He didn't answer, because some words are too heavy to meet right away. Instead, he lifted his hat, brushed the sweat from his brow, and let silence speak back to them. The house, the land, and the women, none of it empty, none of it waiting. It was already full of a life he hadn't yet begun to understand. Papers mean little when silence builds walls thicker than stone. Boone did what any man in his place would have done. He reached into his coat and drew out the folded deed, the seal faded but still clear, and held it in plain sight. The paper looked fragile in his calloused hands, almost foolish against the rough timbers of the porch and the steady eyes fixed on him. The women didn't lean forward to see it. They didn't move at all. Their gaze remained level, as if the document meant no more than dust blowing at their boots. Boone let his arm fall back to his side. He slid the deed away again, careful, as though it were only for him and no one else. With no word exchanged, he turned from the porch and led his horse out past the yard, where the fence sagged low. There, on the edge of the property, he found a patch of level ground. He drove his stake, stretched the canvas, and built himself a camp just beyond reach of the house's shadow. It wasn't an exile, and it wasn't permission. It was simply where the silence told him to be. The days that followed passed in a rhythm of watching. Boone worked small chores around his camp, tending the horse, mending gear, gathering wood. Across the yard, the women went about their business without once glancing his way. Helena, the tall one, carried water from the spring, her stride long and certain. Ruth, hair pinned neat, bent over wash or cooking, her hands quick and sure. May, the freckled one, moved restless, driving cattle back from straying, hammering at a loose board, shoulders taut with effort. Their movements filled the yard with sound, boots on planks, buckets knocking, tools striking wood. Still, not a word carried across the space between them. That gap was a wall thicker than any fence. Boone felt it each evening when he built his fire, the smoke trailing thin into the sky. He ate from his tin plate and listened to the house, to the muted thud of footsteps inside, to the low murmur of voices that never reached his camp. When darkness fell, lamplight shone through a window for an hour, then went dark, leaving the house hulking against the stars, like a ship drawn up on dry land. He didn't intrude, didn't press. He waited because he knew about wounds that couldn't be hurried. Silence had been his own companion long enough for him to recognize it in others. And so the days settled into a standoff, without anger. 4 souls living within sight of one another, bound together by the same stretch of ground, yet divided by a silence thick as dust after a cattle drive. Boone slept each night, within reach of the house, but not within it. He told himself he was patient, but patience too is a kind of hunger. It gnawed at him as steady as the creak of his saddle when he shifted in the dark. The land was not empty, neither were they. Yet all of it, the house, the fields, the women, and Boone himself, moved under the weight of what was left unsaid. Each woman carries a scar, and in their wounds Boone sees his own reflection. It took time, the kind measured not in hours, but in small observations, a glance caught in passing, the pause of a hand, the weight behind a movement. Boone, from his camp, began to see what the silence had been guarding. Helena carried herself like a wall of stone, her shoulders squared against wind or man alike. She split logs with an axe swung true, her body steady, never wavering. Yet when the blade stuck deep in the grain and she paused to wipe her brow, her gaze would slip past the tree line and hold there, far off, as if chasing something she could never bring back. That look, stretched long across the horizon, was not the look of strength. It was the look of someone who had grown tired of proving it. Ruth kept to the smallest of labors. She cooked, she sewed, she swept the porch boards clear of dust that blew back with every gust. It was as if she poured herself into details so the hours would not collapse on her. Boone noticed the way her hands lingered on worn fabric, mending the same seam twice, or the way she stirred a pot long after it was needed. Work, for her, was not just necessity. It was shelter, a place to hide from the weight of memory. May was different. She met the world sharp, shoulders forward, jaw set, as though daring it to come at her again. She wrestled fence rails back into place, drove cattle with a whip crack that echoed down the valley. Yet Boone's eyes caught her once, standing still in the barn, fingers on a bridle. The leather trembled because her hand trembled. She dropped it quick, but the truth was plain. Fire in her didn't mean she'd never been burned. Piece by piece, Boone put it together without words. These women were not holding the land by accident. They had been left here, with work unfinished and promises broken. Whoever the last man was, the seller who'd signed away this farm, he had taken more than money when he rode off. He had taken trust, leaving only the scar of betrayal. And in their silence, Boone saw himself reflected. He knew what it was to be abandoned, to lose the people he had once leaned on. He carried that same mark, just hidden beneath a layer of dust and distance. Watching them was like looking into a mirror he had not asked for but could not turn away from. Evenings came, and he sat by his small fire, while lamplight flickered faint through the window of their house. He heard them sometimes, the low murmur of voices, the scrape of a chair across a floor. A life still lived, but never offered outward. It reminded him of his own long nights, talking to no one but the wind. The land held them all the same way, scarred but standing, worn but enduring. And Boone, sitting with his back against his saddle, realized that this place was not empty ground, waiting to be claimed. It was soil already watered with loss, still carrying the weight of those who remained when someone else walked away. Then come the quiet offerings: a bowl of soup, a blanket, a handful of seed. The shift began without ceremony, the way most changes do, quietly, almost hidden, as if the land itself wanted to see if Boone was paying attention. One evening, when the air carried the bite of autumn, Ruth walked across the yard. She didn't say a word. She only set down a bowl of soup near Boone's fire. Steam curled into the cold, smelling of beans and wild herbs. Then she turned and walked back, her apron catching the glow, before she slipped again into the house. Boone ate slowly, careful with each spoonful, as though honoring the silence she had left behind with her gift. Another night, a front came down from the north. The canvas of his camp snapped in the wind, and the cold worked its way into his bones. At dawn, he found an extra wool blanket folded neat beside his gear. No note, no glance from the porch. Only Helena's broad figure moving off toward the woodpile, an axe balanced across her shoulder. The blanket smelled faintly of cedar. Boone pulled it over himself the next night, and felt warmth he hadn't asked for, but couldn't turn away. May came last. She was the one who had met the world with teeth bared, who kept her distance with sharp eyes. One afternoon she walked up from the field with dirt still clinging to her hands. Without a word, she pressed a small pouch into Boone's palm. Seeds, rough and dry, meant for planting. She didn't linger, didn't wait for thanks, just kept walking, her braid bouncing against her back. Boone stood holding the pouch long after she was gone, the weight of it somehow heavier than it should have been. None of them spoke, not of trust, not of forgiveness, but those gestures: soup set in the dark, a blanket against the cold, a handful of seed, spoke in a language older than words. They said, "We see you. You're not invisible here." And Boone, sitting by his fire, knew the wall between them was beginning to crack. Not from argument, not from demand, but from the simplest acts of care. Each night, the distance between camp and house felt shorter, though he never moved his stake. Each day the silence seemed less like a barrier, more like a bridge waiting to be crossed. He felt it in the rhythm of their work, in the way their shadows passed across the yard. The land itself seemed to breathe easier, as if it had been holding tension too. The cottonwoods rattled softer in the wind. Even the horse, sensing what Boone would not yet admit, stood calmer at the hitch rail when the women came near. It wasn't yet belonging. It wasn't yet trust. But in the quiet, Boone knew something had shifted. The storm breaks, and four strangers fight side by side in the rain. The day had worn heavy. The sky, pressed low with a color that wasn't quite dusk yet, carried the weight of night. Cattle shifted uneasily in the far field, tails flicking, ears twitching as if they heard what men could not. Boone felt it too, the kind of stillness that settles before the heavens break open. He looked up, saw the line of black clouds piling on the horizon like mountains born of smoke. By the time the first wind struck, sharp and cold, the house was already shuttered, and the women were moving fast across the yard. Boone tightened his canvas down, but the horse reared against the sudden snap of thunder. Then came the rain, heavy and slanted, beating the land as if it meant to flatten it back into the dust it came from. The barn roof groaned. A fence rail cracked. In the chaos of it, Boone found himself running toward the herd, shoulder to shoulder with figures that moved as sure as the lightning splitting the sky. Helena was already at the gate, rope in hand, bracing with the strength of a seasoned mule team. Ruth darted quick and certain, coaxing calves into the shelter of the lean-to, her skirts clinging with mud. May climbed the corral like it was a ladder to heaven, waving her arms and shouting soundless words into the roar of the storm, driving the animals inward. Boone dropped his weight against a sagging post, held it upright long enough for Helena to lash it down. Rain stung his eyes, his shirt clung heavy, but there was no pause, no thought, only the unspoken rhythm of people fighting together for something that mattered. No one commanded, no one explained. Each knew where the other would be, as if the land itself had bound them in one motion. Hours, or maybe only minutes later, it was done. The cattle stood shivering but safe, the last rail tied down, the roof patched with whatever boards were near. The storm still raged, but the worst of the work had passed. Soaked to the bone, the four of them stumbled into the house. Boots left trails of mud across the floorboards. A fire was coaxed back to life, its light shaky at first, then steady, warming the steam off their clothes. They sat close, the crackle filling the space words could not. Helena leaned forward, her broad hands spread to the flames. Water still dripped from her hair, but her voice, when it came, was quieter than the storm outside. "If you stay," she said, eyes fixed on the fire, "don't stay for paper. Stay because we need each other." The words weren't plea, nor order. They were truth, laid bare like timber stripped of bark. Boone didn't answer. He stared at the flames, watched the shadows play across their tired faces. In the silence, something settled between them, not fragile, not forced, just the weight of what they had shared out there in the storm. And for the first time since he'd set foot on that land, the house no longer felt like it was holding him out. It felt, in some small and wordless way, as if it had let him in. Come morning, Boone does not ride away. He lifts a shovel instead. Morning came clear, the kind of sky that follows a storm, washed blue, sharp-edged, every line of the hills cut clean against the horizon. The land looked as though it had been baptized, the dust pressed down, the air sweet with the smell of wet earth. Boone rose from his bedroll, stiff, but not with the weariness of travel. It was the kind of tired that comes after shared labor, a weight carried together. He fed the bay a handful of grain, then stood a long while looking toward the house. Smoke rose thin from the chimney. The sight of it should have told him to pack his gear and ride on, deed in hand, as he'd planned from the start. Instead, he reached for the shovel, leaning against his canvas. The fence at the edge of the yard had given way in the night. Rails lay half buried in mud, posts sagging like old men bent by weather. Boone set to work, boots sinking in the softened ground. He didn't glance toward the porch, didn't call for help. He just dug, lifted, set the post straight again. Each strike of the spade into earth sounded like a drumbeat marking a choice he had not spoken aloud. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement. Helena, arms crossed, stood in the doorway. Ruth appeared beside her, apron tied tight, hands folded. May leaned on the porch rail, her braid dripping rainwater down her back. None of them said a word. They only watched as Boone worked, the quiet between them holding more weight than any argument. At last, Helena stepped down, boots thudding softly in the damp earth. She bent to lift a rail, her strength steady beside his. Ruth fetched nails, a hammer balanced carefully in her palm. May gathered what rails could be salvaged, her sharp movements eased of their usual edge. They joined him without comment, 4 sets of hands finding the same rhythm, shoulders aligned against the same labor. The fence rose again, straighter than before, mud drying in the sun around its base. When the last rail was set, they stood together a moment, breathing hard, mud streaked up to their knees. Boone leaned on the shovel. The women glanced at one another, then back at him. Still no words. None were needed. In that silence, an understanding settled, unwritten, unspoken, yet binding as any oath. They were no longer strangers divided by a deed or by suspicion. They were people who had weathered a storm side by side, who had chosen, by work and by presence, to stand together. Boone wiped the sweat from his brow, met their eyes one by one, and felt the truth of it. He hadn't stayed because of land or law. He had stayed because without saying so, they had all asked him to, and he had answered, not with speech, but with the simple act of not leaving. In the rhythm of work and bread shared, silence turns to belonging. The days that followed carried no announcement, no sudden change. They simply unfolded into a rhythm that felt older than any deed or contract. Morning light poured over the yard, and the work began, as it always did. But now it was 4 sets of hands dividing the weight. Boone climbed the roof with a hammer and a pouch of nails, setting shingles back into place where the wind had torn them loose. He moved slow, careful not to waste. Below, Ruth knelt in the garden, her fingers pressing seed into dark soil softened by the storm. She worked with a gentleness that made the rows straight as lines drawn on paper. Out in the pasture, May drove the cattle, her whistle carrying sharp and sure across the open land. Helena shouldered the axe, hauling logs from the grove, the sound of her steady swings echoing like a heartbeat through the valley. There was little talk. It wasn't needed. A glance, a nod, the way a tool was passed from one hand to another. These were enough. The silence that once lay heavy between them had shifted into something easier, a space that allowed each of them to breathe without fear. Meals began to gather them, under the same roof. At first, Boone sat awkward at the table, hands rough against the smooth wood, uncertain where to place his eyes. But Ruth would slide bread toward him without a word. Helena would pour the coffee. May would break the silence with some dry remark about the cattle. The talk never went far, but the warmth of their presence filled more than the plates before them. At night, when the day's work was done, they sometimes sat together on the porch. Boone listened as the women spoke quietly among themselves about planting, about trade, about chores yet to come. He added little, yet felt no lack. It was enough to sit there, the smell of lamp oil and wood smoke rising, and know he was no longer apart from the life within those walls. Little by little, he felt the ground steady beneath him. The ache of years on the trail began to ease. He found himself humming low while mending tack, something he hadn't done since before loss had driven him west. And when he caught Ruth's faint smile as she passed, or May's sharp eyes softening for just a heartbeat, or Helena's quiet nod when their tasks met in the middle, Boone knew he had not wandered into this place by accident. Each of them carried a scar. He saw it in the way Ruth lingered over a stitch, in May's restless drive, in Helena's far-off stare. He carried his own as well. But working side by side, sharing bread and silence, the scars no longer stood apart. They belonged to the same soil now. The farm was no longer theirs or his. It was something built in the middle ground, with sweat and patience, with gestures too small for words, yet too deep to be forgotten. And in that steady rhythm, Boone felt something he had long thought lost, the weight of belonging, lightened by the hands that carried it with him. At dusk on the porch, they need no vows, only the comfort of staying. The months turned slow, measured by the rise of crops and the swell of calves in the pasture. Spring had passed into summer, and the land answered with color, corn tasseling gold, grass thick and green across the low ground, cattle glossy under the sun. The fences stood straight now, the roof no longer leaked, and the garden rows stretched neat as hymnlines. What had once been a house leaning into the wind had become a home that could carry its own weight. One evening, when the work was done and the light was falling soft, the four of them gathered on the porch. The boards had been scrubbed clean, a table built wide enough for all, chairs worn smooth by daily use. Boone sat with his boots stretched out, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand. Helena settled beside him, her arm resting on the rail, her eyes tracing the horizon where the sun dropped behind the ridges. Ruth brought out a plate of cornbread still warm, the smell rich in the cooling air. May leaned back against a post, her braid loose, her laughter quiet as she swatted at a moth circling the lamplight. They didn't talk of the storm that had first bound them together, nor of the man who had left before Boone came. Those names and memories no longer ruled the place. What mattered was here, the fields full, the herd settled, the porch wide enough for silence to rest easy among them. The sky shifted to dusk, painting the land in deep blues and copper. Fireflies blinked along the fence line. Somewhere beyond, a coyote called, its note sharp but lonely, fading quick against the stillness. Boone looked at the women beside him, at Helena's steady presence, Ruth's gentle hands folded in her lap, May's restless spirit finally quiet for the night, and he felt something settle inside him. Not triumph, not possession, simply the peace of knowing he had found the place where he was meant to stop. No vows were spoken, no promises carved in stone, only the sound of chairs creaking, the steam lifting from cups, the steady rhythm of breathing shared in the open dark. And as the last light slid across the fields, Boone thought of how the land had seemed empty when he first arrived. Bare earth, a hollow house, 3 figures in shadow. Now, that same land shone full. Not perfect, not without its scars, but alive with the simple grace of people who had chosen, in their own quiet way, to remain. The sun dipped, leaving only the glow of lamplight through the window, and the hush of evening wrapped around them. In that silence, there was no need for answers. Belonging had already spoken. Out here, under a sky wide enough to hold every sorrow and every hope, a man can learn that life doesn't have to be grand to be good. Sometimes it's enough to share work, to pass bread across a table, to sit in silence while the sun sinks behind the fields. Boone had come looking for a place to rest his weary bones, and what he found was something deeper. A quiet belonging stitched together, not by promises, but by presence. The West was never meant to be easy. It was meant to be honest, and in that honesty, scars can be carried without shame, and broken lives can fit together to make something whole. If this story has brushed against a memory of your own, of finding family where you least expected, or of carrying scars that someone else helped lighten, leave a word or two below. Not to judge, not to explain, but to share. Because sometimes the smallest stories, offered with sincerity, are what remind us that none of us ride alone forever.